I'll take your lead. Okay.
Great. So, Alexander, thank you very much for the conversation. Always good to speak with you. And the world is changing in every way at the moment, as we've just been discussing. How do you think the world of architecture is changing in terms of future trends? How do you think the current shape of the world is going to change the industry in the future, and the future trends that we're going to see?
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Will, for that intro. And about predictions for the future trends, we could talk about styles, of course, and who's famous, who's doing this, who's doing that. But I want to go back a little bit, go back to more kind of like back to basics or back to the fundamentals.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned about our book, Archifantasy. When I started writing Archifantasy several years ago, the world remained seemingly a nicer place to be. There was no pandemic, for example. But now, as we are approaching the end of 2020, we cannot but address the future of our architecture, urban cities, civilization, and our planet Earth even, in a very different and drastic light.
Yeah.
Drastically different light.
Yeah.
So before we talk about the future trends, we need to do some background checks, some fundamental background checks. So let's begin by focusing on the big picture from 3 different angles. Mm-hmm. In terms of demographics, the current world population is around 7.8 billion as of March 2020. And we all talked about, Al Gore mentioned this, it took us 2 million years of human civilization for the world's population to reach 1 billion, and then 200 years more to reach 7 billion. So this whole urbanism experience really happened 200 years. 200 years ago, which is, you're talking about 1820 to now. That's when we have Paris, we have London, we have modern cities like New York, now Beijing, Hong Kong, all those amazing cities that we associate with, that seems to be there for, a very, very long time. But no, it's actually before then. There was nothing. It was just very, very low density kind of arrangement. But now it's very different. And the global population may reach 8 billion by 2024. We're talking about 4 years from now. And it's likely to reach around 9 billion by 2042. Alternative scenarios for 2050 range from a low 7.4 billion to a high of more than 10.6 billion. And it would be just a disaster. This will have a devastating effect on the planet, including not enough resources like food, water, air, education, healthcare, infrastructure, you name it. Not enough housing, which is what we're talking about today, in terms of urbanism and architecture.
Yeah.
And then living with a high density arrangement, means high risks, like health risks. For example, this pandemic, it's obviously a problem now, and creating even more geopolitical, financial, and social problems. So big headache here.
Yeah.
So that's the one angle I want to mention, which is demographics. The second one is, of course, the climate change. Most of our low-lying international cities and coastlines are in danger of being partially wiped out for good, or at least seriously affected by climate change when our civilization reaches 2050. Just think of our underground system, okay? All cities have the tube, like London, and say occasionally flooded with 10% of the time, and all the metropolitan highways underwater for say 15 to 30 days once every 2 years. This disruption and financial cost will be extremely considerable.
Yeah. It's like a virus all over again.
Because of this global warming, this creates mass movement of refugees due to climate change. The future will not be dominated by political refugees seeking political asylums, but rather climate change refugees seeking food, water, and anyone could end up being a climate refugee overnight. Look at California, for example, with all the fires, because it was so dry. And it's frightening, but we need to be prepared for massive human population displacement within our lifetime, even if we successfully survive this pandemic.
Yeah.
This global warming effect will affect everything, from food supply chains to biodiversity of planet. We simply don't have time to discuss this daunting issue today in any details, and we don't want to just glibly assign blame either. So let's just move on from here, and we've just covered two angles, right? Namely population overload and climate change. The third angle is related to geopolitical, socio-economical paradigm shifts. Now, let's talk a little bit about Ray Dalio. He's the hedge fund guru from Bridgewater. He's American, and he's also an international bestseller, selling author. And there are three things that he highlights which are going on right now, which seriously affect us. The first one is the end of the long-term debt cycle when central banks are no longer effective. Mm-hmm. The second one is an extreme wealth gap. Therefore, all these refugees and also people who are extremely wealthy, with an intense political polarity, creating millions of homeless people in just America alone. We cannot really trust these figures, as the problem is getting much worse this year, and no one is really doing any accurate head count. Mm. And I think, with what's going on in the world right now, I don't need to dig in with this aspect. And then the third thing he mentions a lot is there's another rising world power, or other rising world powers, challenging existing ones, which will be too sensitive for us to get into here today. Because once we get into that, who's challenging who,
it's a huge topic,
a political discussion. And I think this podcast is really about something else. So let's not do that, and maybe do it another time.
Yeah.
Besides the aforementioned three aspects of the big picture, we have another set of critical issues concerning the current built environment, heavily based on the approval system of our statutory building procedures or planning procedures. Now, we need to try and briefly explain how to understand our built environment from a statutory point of view, as things don't get built automatically without receiving a bunch of government approvals. So let's go back and backtrack a little bit. Background. We're not trying to solve any one of these humongous problems here today, but we could certainly point out the difficulties in our systems within the architectural profession, whereupon if we do not drastically change the ways we perceive the troubling nature of our situation at hand, we will miss the boat and lose the big battle entirely. So first things first, architecture or just building is, I'm afraid, sorry, Mr. Le Corbusier, it's not a machine architect. It's not that simple. It's deeply embedded in our system of law, concept of ownership and government planning, which involves endless statutory procedures, not just technology, art, or finance alone. So when we first look at a piece of architecture or building, for example, we talk about function, style, proportion, materials, history, engineering, lighting, technology, and the list goes on and on and on, which is all very well, except we have missed out a bunch of other stuff. And what we don't normally talk about enough are the other fundamentals that make a building an entity that exists within our highly complex society with a multiplicity of roles, functions, and associations like ownership, zoning, valuation, infrastructure, etc. First and foremost, we need to talk about the three basic aspects associated with any real estate development. And that is planning, which involves the planning department, urban planning. The second is the lease of the land, which deals with the ownership, and that's usually the land department's territory. And then, and what we normally talk about, as an architect is just building regulations, building codes and fire codes, and which belongs to some kind of building department. In all countries, in one way or another. Now, this looks quite simple and well, but in fact, if we wish to change any one of the above, in terms of when I say change, like you want to change a building code, you want to change a zoning plan, if you want to change a particular article within the land lease, the process will take up enormous length of time. Say a simple change of use, turning a piece of land from commercial to residential for a piece of land in the planning department could take up anything from 2 years to 10 years. Wow. A change in the lease is another long-winded process involving land premium, which must be negotiated at length with the government. And time is one thing we don't have right now for change, which is much needed. Basically, I mean, everything's changing so fast because of the pandemic, because of global warming, because of population overload. We cannot wait and take 10 years to do one thing and
Yeah,
hope
the
that,
world will be different.
somehow we'll solve that problem, because the problems are too big and they change too fast.
Yeah,
We have not even begun to talk about dismantling some of these existing buildings that will gradually become problematic within our lifetime if we do not go forward with change. For example, shopping malls. People are not shopping so much now because of getting things through Amazon. Glass
Yeah.
office towers, people can work from home. Cinemas, people don't go to cinemas so much. They watch Netflix. Hotels is another problem. And even like buildings like, university buildings, for example, like good old libraries. You can look at a book, well, just read a book.
Yeah, it's very
And
outdated.
stuff like that. Yeah. So building regulations could be changed, but by the time any such regulations are relaxed, it would take another lengthy period of time to get the actual much needed change to be executed and then brought about to its realization. And this will be too late to solve the problems of our current situation. So clearly, when we do have a pandemic and a climate change refugee displacement situation all rolled into one at any given time, we know any government could not possibly handle things quickly enough by changing the legal procedures for land use zoning, building regulations for new or existing buildings, and fix the infrastructure to accommodate such large-scale changes.
Yeah.
And you know what? That time has arrived. We have to start thinking about change and look at the results with so many countries not being able to cope with our predicament. If there is ever a time to think not just outside the box, but beyond the planet, so to speak, then this is the time. We need to come up with some workable solutions fast. Well, in fact, like yesterday. Time and cost with lengthy legal procedures and processes will be our major hindrances for any immediate solutions that will help us to ameliorate any sudden unforeseen crisis. And in the past 20 years, since 2001, we've been living in a kind of time warp, not knowing we have entered an entirely new era in history. We now are starting to wake up to these massive and daunting challenges, and with only 30 years before we reach the midpoint of 21st century. With everything we are going to create within the next 30 years, the focus will have to be free from zoning restrictions, lease requirements, building regulation, except maybe safety regulations involving fire codes, of course. We need high flexibility, quicker speed of construction, possibly very lightweight for easier transport and made with materials for more energy efficient insulation and manufactured in a few centralized factories somewhere, or in order to reduce the cost of building reusable temporary buildings and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was quite a big spiel. But after covering all this background, we could now talk a bit about the future trends and ideas. With mostly non-traditional trends here, I'm going to mention most of these trends being like a bit off the beaten track, which will involve meeting our global challenges with innovations for tomorrow. We'll notice that these trends involve leaving the urban areas of the cities, which is, I think, the general trend at the moment. Leave the city, or at least don't go to the city so often. Well, the first trend is, I think, at floating communities. We have houseboats communities, of course, already in existence, like the ones developed in the Netherlands, which could beat rising tides due to climate change in some ways. And as long as the planning department will allow this to happen, there will be no land ownership issues involved, for the time being at least. And the fire regulations can be less rigorous, as water is always nearby in abundance. So you just put out a fire if there's a fire on the houseboats. Or these houseboats.
It's simpler.
The speed of creating such a community could be extremely impressive, as everything could be manufactured on a massive scale in a few centralized giant factories and then shipped to the coastline, wherever they are needed. And the running energy issue of these floating homes will have to be resolved, but using natural seawater pumped to the roof and having to cool off these buildings during the summer months at least will help us somewhat, like reducing the cost for like air conditioning. Also, a pluggable and flexible sewer system below water will have to be worked out as well. But that should not be too much of a problem, as the Dutch architects have developed these for years, overcoming most of the technical challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Needless to say, massive initiatives and support from all governments with coastlines will have to come forward first. And this, now that this is the crux of the problem, and this will most likely upset the financial equilibrium of the status quo, affecting lots of real estate developers who are supporting the status quo of any elected government and their officials. Do you see the dynamics here?
Yeah.
Which I think we don't need to go into details.
There are several
so
parties
because
involved.
everything is involving ownership and money, and and then territory. It's once you push something forward, then there will be a reaction, and that reaction might not lead to a successful head start for this initiative. Trend 2. Let's go to trend 2. The second trend is campsites. People will be roaming around like urban nomads, and they will be going around and around in, to different parts of. These are not the human displacement problem we mentioned just now because of climate change, that could also be part of it. But there'll be a lot more people living in their, say, recreational vehicle, the RVs, what they call RVs in America, caravans. And also in temporary tents on campsites, and migrate around the country for all kinds of different reasons, including financial, climatic, social, or even personal. This sounds like The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck all over again, but they did not have cell phones back then, so it's not that bad. I mean, you can live quite comfortably roaming around countries to countries. Europe,
there are some very luxurious ones now.
Yeah. I mean, that is another trend. I see a lot of people taking that trend, especially those who have semi-retired, for example, or working from home even. The trend 3 is an interesting one. It's called what I call farming communes. A lot of what's happening will force people to abandon living in cities and go back to where the food source is, where the food is from. Like working in a farm, including high-tech hydroponic farming, and no matter how mechanized they will have become. This societal breakdown we see happening in, say, North America is unheard of and will culminate in some very big changes in the near future. A lot of my friends, younger kids who are post-millennials, start running into farms, start running towards the farms as their preferred and idealized future lifestyles. They these millennials, they're very different in the sense that they don't understand why we have to live in a box, which is probably an apartment or a house or whatever. Then you drive yourself in a box, which is a car, to another bigger box, which is a supermarket, to go inside and get a box of cereal, which is the food in another box, take it back into the little box, which is the car, take it back to the house, which is another box, open the box of the cereal, and eat it in a bowl. You see, I mean, it is in a sense crazy, because this only happened like maybe 150 years ago, or less even, 20 years ago. I don't know when Kellogg was around, but I think it's the beginning of last century. So this whole idea of breakfast from a box is actually very, very, very weird if you think about it. And, human civilization for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, we did not eat things out of a box. So these millennials, they see things in a totally different light. And I really think that, they don't believe in this kind of like supermarket, real estate, shopping malls, cinemas, stock market, booms and busts. That sort of whole, existence. Maybe they're seeking something else, and they're looking for something, what I call, towards creating a new kind of non-religious, Amish communities all over again, but with cell phones, of course, and some medical care. Okay, another trend. The 4th trend I want to talk about is island communities. This concept is obviously a lot more upscale and expensive. Let's say a few hedge funds gurus get together and buy up an island in the middle of the Caribbean or East Africa, or West Africa. Like Richard Branson or other equally famous newsmakers. That is not unheard of. In fact, maybe 10 years ago, our firm met with a couple from the Silicon Valley. They made their fortune in the Silicon Valley, and they've already bought an island and asking for our advice on how to proceed further in building their Paradise Island resort.
Very nice.
You can also create a fishing community, of course, and live off your investment, or even frugally living off the fisheries farmed from the seas. These privileged classes will also have power yachts and sailboats, so they could occasionally travel to nearby similar communities whenever necessary, like big sailboat.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Nice lifestyle.
Okay, now we go another, towards another direction, and that is like another trend, and that is Mars. Everyone is talking about Mars because of Elon Musk, because of the other Branson as well.
Branson, yeah,
yeah, and also Jeff of Amazon. So Foster is doing that already, but the challenge here is how to make these Mars communities self-sustaining. I think some of these designs are done by Norman Foster. But Elon Musk's concern is, he's asking this big question, is how do you make them self-sustaining? Because there's no point of having, these, kind of like communities set up and then Earth has to keep replenishing their supplies. And that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
So they cannot just rely on supplies from planet Earth, as this will be too dangerous and not really effective. Given our planet and current civilizations is not at its best state of health, this is going to be a very real alternative. And as other countries are creating moon bases as well, our future habitats for Homo sapiens will have to be spread out further towards the entire solar system and not just remaining on planet Earth. So these are the 5 trends, big directions that I want to, draw your attention to, or everyone's attention to, rather than talking about just building technology, or talk about style, or talk about some interesting designer, or even ways of living, because I think these are very, very fundamental and crucial changes that will not go away for at least the next 10 years. We'll have to deal with those problems. How we respond to climate change, population overload, and also this kind of like wealth inequality. These are much bigger problems, and it will affect urbanism. It will affect architecture.
Yeah, so, it's very interesting. Yeah, and it's almost like it's the, at first you spoke about the world's problems as a whole in many ways, but then you referenced how architecture plays a part in those, which is really interesting for sure. And I suppose we're already facing a lot of those difficulties now. Population overload. How many cities are there in the world now where people are living in literal boxes, tiny apartments, and the price is absolutely crazy to live in them. So we're already facing those problems. Like you said, it needs to start yesterday. So, you started your firm, Alexander Wong Architects, about 20 years ago. Is that right? 19 years ago. So all these problems and these trends that you mentioned, were they still there 20 years ago? Or were there different ones? Or, when did they come into play?
I think we know there's always going to be a possibility, shall we say, of a pandemic, because we went through SARS, 17 years ago. But the thing is that for some reason, we are like a civilization living with amnesia. We forget. Put it another way, I think we block it off. We just block off the problems and then hope for the best. It's like a gambler's sort of my mentality going to Las Vegas. You've just lost 10 million, so you take another 10 million and hope they will make that 10 million back. And maybe you do, you see. So I think, the stock market is one. It's like it really is a bit like Las Vegas in some ways. Yeah. So it's very, very hard to change that way of thinking, because maybe that's how we go on. We can't talk about death. We can't talk about, losing everything day in, day out, because it would just be too depressing. So once we overcome something, we forget the problems that existed before, and then we just hope that, oh well, we'll deal with it later, type of thing. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
even 20 years ago, of course, as I said, 2003, we had SARS. But did we change the way we live? No, we didn't. We just built even smaller apartments. Did we do something about the hygiene factor in architecture? Did we deal with, cinemas having ultraviolet light because they never get any sunlight, of course? Did we do something about um, like, like what are we going to do with schools? Because we went through SARS and people couldn't go to school. So were we more prepared for online education, for example? I don't think enough was done, even here, and let alone all those other countries who never experienced SARS. And I think that now, this year, 2020, is a very, very big wake-up call that we are already in the 21st century, but we're living in the 20th century. I think that's something very obvious that we're still thinking about. Look at the pop art that we're going through, or even architecture in some ways. I mean, there's this new trend that people hark back to the 50s mixed with the 30s. Yeah, there's this trend which is like an Art Deco style mixed with the pastel colors of the 50s. And that's very in right now.
Yeah,
or
like Miami-esque.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then and also the TV, they watch things from the 80s, right? There's a big 80s revival, and saying, oh, what a wonderful time it was, and how creative everyone was, but maybe they didn't put everything into context. I lived through the 80s as well, so I remembered it slightly differently. It was actually a very tumultuous times too. So we kind of like idealized the past, which is the way we all do. I mean, we talk about, we go back to the Tudors, right? And forget about all the the violence. And then we just talk about, Shakespeare in love, if you know what I mean. That sort of
Yeah,
thing,
it's true.
gloss it
Yeah.
over. And then we think about the 80s, and we forgot about there was another very big problem with health. It was a health crisis that we don't need to get into right now. So it's like we try to like just push things underneath the carpet, and then and then we're still like harking back to the 80s, the 50s, and the 30s of the last century, whereas we should really look forward and think of what we're going to do with the future. But in a way, futurism, it's not presented like that. I mean, we do have a style of futurism, but that futurism is like an idealized version of an imagined future, but not really dealing with the problems of the future, which has to be science, and also technology. We're on the brink of the AI revolution. I mean, we are already in it, but we're on the brink of transcendence, and we know AI will come in, and they will do the programming. And in the beginning, they will do, they will improve their programming, maybe improve it by 100% within 3 years. And then that would speed up, and then that would be improved by 100% within maybe 14 months. And then it will be 7 months, and then 2 months, and then 2 weeks, and then, and then it would be like 2 days. And then before you know it, might be 2 hours. They can increase the efficiency and the intelligence by 100% within 2 hours. Now, that's
it's
not,
very
I mean,
possible.
it can be frightening, but you have to understand what's going on before we actually go forward, because that's going to affect everyone. And then where are the jobs? How are we going to provide enough food for everyone? And then how are we going to deal with moral issues? Like, you can't have so many kids because the state cannot look after everyone and provide them with enough food, for example. And then, I mean, America is still talking about, the abortion rights, of course, Roe versus Wade, they're still talking about that. And I think it's a very, very complex issue, of course. I don't pretend I know how to solve it, but we know for a fact that the AI is going to affect us in a very big way, including architecture. And I know we're talking about architecture and urbanism today, but without addressing those issues, everything we talk about is very superficial. Like, what color should I use here? Or, you know, what material is in right now, and what kind of style is in right now? What are the reasons for this change? And is it solving any of the bigger and major problems of what we're going through? And architecture and urbanism is it's our life. I mean, it's our environment. So
yeah, it affects every element of our life.
yeah, and
Yeah,
it's a result of what's happening within our civilization, and what we've touched upon just now. All those issues are going to affect architecture and
yeah,
urbanism and city living in a very big way, I think. And I know
yeah.
you're in London right now, and you guys are going through, you know, things that you've never experienced before. And I think that it's just a very, very difficult time right now, but one that we must deal with head on. Otherwise, we'll really miss the boat and lose the battle. I think I've already mentioned that earlier in the introduction on the background.
Yeah,
So,
it's already too late in many ways. It's already past it.
well,
Yeah.
yeah, but we can't just keep. Well, we are
No,
architects,
it's
and we are,
it's
you
some
know, we can't
elements.
just say
Yeah.
it's too late. It's too late. But I mean, we have to give it a good fight at least. Come on. And
Yeah,
okay,
some things are too late, some things aren't.
No, I mean, with the things that we talked about is in a way a response to the it's already too late, like floating communities, living on houseboats, farming communes, and campsites, or living on a caravan. These are already responses to the assumption that we'll lose the battle of climate change and population overload and income inequality.
Yeah,
and when I'm talking about massive income inequality, of course, not just a little bit. And it's just one thing after another. And I think that and I think that the fact that people will go towards those like choices, that's why they're trending. It's because I mentioned earlier that the government cannot change land use, zoning plans, building regulations to adapt to this massive change and happening so fast. And I think if we don't look at it dead on, like this problem, what are we going to do? Are we going to allow these trends to go on and then never change those regulations? Now it gets really political. Or are we just going to pretend that, okay, well, we'll get over this, like SARS, 17 years ago, and then just sail through this thing, and then everything will be hunky-dory from now on. And then my question is, what about the next? It's not even a pandemic, it's the next problem, which is the
next
AI problem, which we have to deal with, because there won't be any jobs. And how are we going to and people say, no, there'll always be some jobs. That's not the case. I mean, really, there'll be robots coming out, self-driving cars, of course, and a lot of unthinkable, sort of improvements. Because, our human intelligence is not comparable to AI eventually. And people say, oh, no, we are more creative. I think we're overestimating ourselves. And I mean, Elon Musk thinks that we are living in a matrix even. He questions that. And maybe we are. And then all the money we poured into education, are we preparing for human civilization moving into the next phase? I think that's also a truly legitimate question. People spending, I mean, we know there's a big debt problem, student debt problem, of people going to university, borrowing money from the government or from companies, insurance company or whatever. And then they use this money and invest in their kind of education. But if they can't make a living afterwards, or they have no jobs, then how will they repay the debt? And then that's a very, very big problem that it's going to explode, I mean, eventually.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah, and I think that we are at a crossroad, really.
Mm.
Um, and it's not just on one level. It's not just, like who to vote for, but fundamentals are at stake and
Mm.
affecting all of us. And I think architecture and urbanism should be looked at from this sort of, like with a wider angle, and not from this narrow way of looking at, like building technology or styles or sustainability. I mean, we talk about sustainability in the building materials, but what about the economic sustainability of that built product? I mean, say it's a library, and then or it's a school, or it's a gym, or it's a hospital. How's that
Mm.
sustainable? And how is it sustainable from a maintenance point of view as well? Like
Mm.
all glass office, or all glass, kind of like auditorium, or or kind of like a kind of a place of congregation, and
Yeah.
it's just not sustainable from another point of
Mm.
view. Even if the building materials are um, are are uh, are are used that are used comes from a sustainable source,
Mm.
environmentally sustainable source. So we have a lot of we have a lot of things to do ahead of
For
us.
sure. For sure.
Going to
Yeah.
be like non-stop.
Yeah, the societal infrastructure is growing slower than the trends, the technological trends that are required, I suppose, is a summary of it. And yeah, no, it's interesting to see how, as you were talking about, houseboats and other places people live. Even in the past, 50 years here in London, there is a house. I said is a 2-bedroom house, and now 4 different people live in it because one person rents one bedroom, one person rents another bedroom, and the landlord changes the living room into a bedroom. So there's 3 people, and then maybe they make another bedroom somewhere. And even 50 years ago, if you said that, that would be absolutely crazy. And I know Hong Kong, where you are, has obviously its own
Cages.
problems
No
with that
people
that
living
sense.
in cages. And
Yeah, yeah, it's
no,
unbelievable.
it's not even crazy. I mean, the crazy thing is that you have triple bunk beds, triple,
Mm.
not double bunk beds, triple bunk beds,
Yeah.
and just people shoved into like almost like catacombs.
Mm.
I mean, it just sounds very derogatory or demeaning, but that's how
But
a lot of
they
people
are horrible.
live now.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
when you have things moving so fast, changing so fast, people have no jobs, no security, and the government can only do so much. Like they always say, oh, we can only do so much. Laissez-faire.
Mm.
You end up with a situation like that, and
Mm.
it's dangerous. Um,
It is, yeah.
it's wrong. I mean, it's morally wrong. But
Mm.
besides that, I mean, besides morality, it's a health hazard. And maybe, like, I mean, that's why we have chicken flu, because the way we do battery farming for the chicken, it's
Yeah.
totally unethical and unhealthy. The way we
Mm.
treat the animals, and
Mm.
that's why they get sick.
Mm.
And their sickness gets back to us like a
It's
karma, like a bad
yeah,
karma.
that's
And
true.
I
We're
think,
eating them, so we're eating their illnesses. So yeah, for sure, it's a big problem. Yeah.
yeah, we have to change the way we eat as well. I mean, the food is
Mm.
another big topic. We keep on mentioning like, oh well, our built environment, but I mean, what's going to happen when we have no food, or we have to eat artificial meat,
Mm.
or maybe that's the only way to go to feed so many people. I mean, the
Mm.
billions of people that we have to provide food for with no
Mm.
jobs.
Yeah.
And they people just say, well, it's going to be, further down the road, but it's not. It really, I
Mm.
mean, this time, I really do not believe that you can just say, okay, we'll just get over it and then we'll deal with those problems later. It's already here, right in front of our doorstep.
Mm.
And if we don't deal with it now, well, the
Yeah.
consequences are unthinkable.
Yeah. I think people get really engulfed in these problems when a Netflix documentary comes out about it, or when some big personality talks about it. Like, I don't know if you've seen David Attenborough has done a Netflix documentary, and it's been
Yeah,
floating all
yeah.
over social media and then so everybody's saying we need to do something, but the reality is, and I'm sure we're all guilty of this to an extent, but the reality is you are very struck by it for maybe a week, but then next week you kind of forgotten about it, so you just go back
2
to,
hours, sorry,
you
2
know,
hours,
leaving the
well,
lights
2
on
hours.
or whatever. Yeah, a week in the biggest case. So
No,
yeah,
because then
I think that's the nature.
because it's a very good point what you've just said, because you are presented with this problem, and then 5 minutes later you look at, there will be a market crash, and then 5 minutes later there's another pandemic, and 5 minutes later there's like a kind of like a regime change in a certain country, and you have friends that, and then another, it's non-stop, so you can't focus on anything. You just like, I mean, a lot of us like these chicken with their head chopped off running around, half chopped off, and then you're running around not knowing where to go, and then just no focus, nothing gets done. And this is not funny anymore, because what we're dealing with is is very serious, and we cannot stress that any stronger. And I think it's very, very good that we talked about this today, because I think people think, oh, our future of future trends in architecture and cities. So they think, oh, glass, or floating cities, and they always like make it look so beautiful, and but they
higher
never ask the
buildings.
question, well, who's paying for it? Who owns it? Who's paying for it? And how is it sustainable? And how can it? And then why would they do that? I mean, of course they would be doing it for profit. And then is that profit plowed back into the community? So to make things a bit more sustainable for everyone, not just a few, well, just of the privileged few, just for the privileged few. And I think that now's the time to ask those questions, at least.
Yeah, I think this is why people are looking towards, this is why Musk and Branson and Bezos, etc., are looking towards Mars. I think it's not just because it's a dream or an egotism reason or anything. I think they probably do. I'm sure part of it is a dream and egotism, but I think a lot of it is that they do actually realize that these problems exist, and Mars may be a suitable alternative in however many years. So I think that conversation probably even 5 years ago was a bit outlandish, and now more and more people are used to talking about it, used to hearing about it, and it's going to become a reality, I think, sooner than everybody expected. So I think that's why these trends are definitely relevant. It's interesting how these, and I've just, from what you were talking about today, it's interesting how the world's problems effectively are all impacted by architecture or vice versa. So it's it's an interesting loop, and it's I suppose it's difficult to say who takes responsibility for it, who has to make an impact. It's probably everybody, or else it would be simpler, and there's when there are so many different factors involved in finding a solution, one of them will always break. So if it's politicians and business leaders in society that have to make a change, there's always one of those which will, for whatever reason, not buy in. I suppose that's why these problems are still there. But we do have people that do care, that do make a difference. I believe you mentioned AI is growing massively, which is obviously true and a big thing. I believe there's a lot of people whose job is to make sure it doesn't take over human race and jobs, but then you never know, if that's true and to what extent, and I'm sure it will take over many jobs. I'm sure it already is. So yeah, it's where do you draw the line, because there's not much point having a planet full of robots in 200 years. So
except to the robots, maybe they find it okay.
I'm sure they do find it okay.
But how do we know that we are not robots? We're just carbon-based robots. I mean, that's the other thing. But with some spirituality. What if we assume that, machines have no spirituality, but they do, or they could achieve a certain level of spirituality as well? I mean, that's one of the big question, I think. Some futurists talk about as well. And I mean, there's so much we don't know. And I think that's one of the things that keeps us awake and keep us on our toes. There's so much we don't know. There's so much to learn. And every day could be exciting. I mean, I know it's very, very tough right now, but there is hope. I think that's the only way we can say it. And if we don't have that, then it's even harder to go on and push forward.
Yeah, and the conversation is more open now than ever. If there's a trend, if there's a topic, many people know about it, so that only increases the chances of people doing something about it. Whereas 100 years ago, there wasn't Netflix or social media or whatever. Therefore, the conversation wasn't as open. So whilst that causes a lot of problems with people arguing over elections and tweets and whatnot, it still means that, you know, the more people are talking about an actual important issue, the more opinions we get on it, the more experts we get on it, and the more likely it's actually going to happen. So yeah, it's very interesting conversation. Thanks for your thoughts on it, which are obviously very useful and very interesting and very relevant as well, given your work. So it'd be great to see how in the next 20 years of your firm, how many houseboats you create, or designs on Mars, or
Well,
whatever,
it's like, I mean,
RVs.
let's just talk about the next 2 weeks, maybe. It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
20 like too far away. All these challenges, you know, engulfing us at the moment. But thank you for organizing this podcast, and I hope lots of people will watch it, and lots of people will give it a thumbs up. And we need the support and spread the word that I think we need to look at these problems in a major way. And you don't have to be an architect, you don't have to be an urban planner to know that these problems exist. And the important thing is that everyone has to chip in and figure out a way how to solve these problems, because we're all in it. And that, in a way, is a good thing. I think that's the only, well, maybe one of the very few good things, is that it's affecting everyone. You can't escape it, no matter where you are from, or even if you think you are privileged or not so privileged, it will get to you eventually.
Yeah, certainly.
Oh, hey, thank you so much. And I think that's a great talk. And let's do it again another time.
Likewise. Yeah, likewise. No, thanks very much to you. Yeah, really appreciate it. And interesting insight as always. Good to speak with you.
Okay. So, bye.
Bye. Speak to you soon.
See you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.